Welcome to Tea Time, my friends, a place where I muse about my gender transition experience and in the process aim to comfort and inspire others to a greater level of self-awareness. I am Artemis. On this video, we're going to be tackling the subject of sex versus gender. And I know that there's a bit of debate out there as to whether sex and gender are actually just the same thing, or even just to define what gender actually is, but we're going to be covering those and a few more things in this video as it relates to that topic. We're going to be enjoying Cocoa Rose Petit Four tea, courtesy of the Rose and Vine Gift Company, one of my personal favorites. So as we do on this channel, we're going to define these words, gender and sex, so that we can actually be on the same page with this discussion. And it can be surprisingly harder than you think just to agree on the definition of a word so that you can proceed with a conversation. And if you don't do that, it can be the entire reason a conversation fails before it even begins. So, to define sex, that's pretty easy. That definition is either of the two main categories, male and female, into which humans and most other living things are divided on the basis of their reproductive functions. Now, I will say that just because you don't plan to use your reproductive bits as they were given to you, this has no bearing on the definition. In my opinion, this is pretty cut and dry, no matter how you try to argue it. Now, where we run into trouble is when we try to bring gender into the discussion. So I did a little bit of digging. It looks like the term gender stems from the Latin root genus, which just means race, stock, family, kind, rank, order, species, basically characteristics of a particular group of things. It became the word gender and not genus somewhere around the 14th century in the French language. But even at that time, it was still known by the same definition as was originally put forth in Latin. And again, that was to just a word to describe a group of things based on a common characteristic that they shared. So, fast forward all the way to the 1960s, when the term resurfaced again during the counterculture movement to be given a new life with this definition, which is now either of the two sexes, male and female, especially when considered with reference to social and cultural differences rather than biological ones. So, the line has been blurred in that same sentence between sex and gender, as to say that gender can be used to denote both, either a biological sex characteristic or a distinction to be made by social or cultural rules. And this new definition's only come about in the last 60 or so years. So while some things stand the test of time and serve as a form of ancient wisdom passed down through the generations, others can be updated when given logical and scientifically supported reason to do so. I personally think it's time for a reboot of the word gender, now that we have a bit clearer of an understanding of human identities within socio-cultural contexts. So, thus follows my proposition to change the definition, and further personal anecdotes in this video. I'll be doing this with clips from a short video put out by Michael Knowles, because I believe this video gives me a good platform to spring off of.
Gender is not a scientific term. Gender was a term that was never applied to human beings until about the 1960s.
So, real quick, as I described above, it can be important to know the origin of things. You don't know where you're going unless you know where you've been, right? Let's be careful, though, because there's a logical fallacy in here that he teeters on, which is an appeal to tradition. Just because something has always been done a certain way does not mean that it should always be done that way.
The entire purpose of the left making gender into a description of people is to undermine science. It's to separate sex from gender.
I'm not entirely certain that I would speak in such absolutes like he does here. I think that's a common trap that people get into, especially when they begin to get heated about a subject. So I won't claim to know what the left aims to do. But certainly anytime you create something new that has not been yet tested through time, you're bound to encounter kinks in the rollout. Knowles believes this.
There is no difference between sex and gender, but we try to argue about it scientifically. There's no scientific argument.
Now, these things may be true, but again, the definition of the word gender is where I believe things are getting tripped up. You cannot both talk about the application of the word gender in its social or cultural context, and then also its biological context in the same argument, unless you're willing to acknowledge both, and you'll see why in a minute. Both of those contexts work independently of one another, but are equally important to the expression of the word.
This is what the left says. They say sex is biological, but gender is not biological. It's a social construct. It's psychological. It's not physical. It's not the same as sex.
Okay, so there was a lot that happened in that clip, but let's start with the fact that the left defines gender as a social construct. If you go back to the Latin root definition of the word, it just means a certain group of individuals defined by a characteristic or certain characteristics, which can have a social context. For example, women usually wear their hair longer, but it can also mean characteristics that are hardwired or innate. For example, men tend to have better spatial reasoning skills. So right there, context is everything, and an argument can be made in which gender can be a social construct and also of biological nature. If you're like me, although I was born anatomically female, my brain still processes things and sees the world in much the same way that we have documented to be much more characteristic of men. But more on that later. To the next point, I think that Michael conflates social context and psychological when he says that the left thinks gender is social and or psychological in nature. And these two concepts should not be conflated or confused. Psychology, as it's defined, is the scientific study of the human mind and its functions, especially those affecting behavior in a given context. And your behavior can be affected both by your societal influences and your hardwired brain. As in, growing up, I've been socialized as female most of my life and was encouraged to keep my hair really long, which I hated, but I was drawn to Legos as play toys instead of things like Barbies, which, as much as the left might try to argue with you, is just a basic tendency that we have seen demonstrably and repeatedly between little boys and little girls, that they gravitate towards these different things. And thankfully, my parents allowed me to play with whatever it was that I wanted to, so.
But if gender is just a social construct, if it's just sort of a choice, then people should choose to make their gender conform to their biological sex, right? If you can just kind of choose your gender and it's just a matter of your personal will, then if you're biologically a man, but you identify as a female, and that's just a choice, then you should just choose to identify as a male. That's much easier than going through all this awful surgery, mutilating yourself, changing every single bathroom in the country, right? Of course.
So first, I'll say that I don't agree that gender is entirely a social construct, as the left might argue. Even if it were, though, changing something that has been ingrained into your existence from a very early age is very difficult to uncover, let alone try to change. Take, for example, the generational trauma that we see in humans today, who continue to make relationship choices that reflect broken family dynamics. I mean, without tons of therapy, most people may never realize why their relationships fail. They don't see a problem with certain relationship dynamics that are unhealthy, or why they may end up just like mom or dad. Also, I think that he completely discounts that for many people, changing things externally, like surgeries or lobbying for gender-neutral bathrooms, as exhausting as on the surface that sounds, it is still much, much easier than crawling through the depths of your own mind to see who you actually are, underneath everything that you thought was you. That dark night of the soul is no joke. And I can vouch that recovering from top surgery was much, much easier than my own personal journey within myself.
But then what the gender ideologues will say is, it's not quite like that. Sex is in the body, in the chromosomes or the genitals or whatever, but gender is in the brain.
Okay, so back to the point that if you have a definition of gender that includes both sociocultural and biological contexts, you cannot argue for one and just forget the other. Here, I agree that gender is in the brain. It's a biological wiring characteristic. So, going back to men being better at spatial reasoning and women being better at something like expressing or experiencing empathy. Those are hardwired tendencies that tend to be stronger in one or the other. It doesn't mean that they can't be developed, it's just a natural born tendency. For the left to argue that gender is entirely a social construct would mean, as Michael says, that they cannot say it is in the brain without specifying that it must be entirely due to learned influence, as opposed to some other hardwired biological tendency.
So then you have to conclude sex and gender are both biological.
Yes, they are, but gender also has the rider that it can be influenced by culture, but to a lesser extent than its biological characteristics.
So how can your biology be both male and female?
Well, that's pretty easy, Michael. Every single one of us produces both testosterone and estrogen, and our brains are still human with crossover between traits that are either more prevalent in males or females within a single brain. So while you may not have reproductive markers of both, your biology, depending on what kind of micro level you want to discuss, can and often is indeed both male and female. And this is the kind of nuance that is often lost when people are trying to win an argument. And our world is just full of things that are not simply black or white. Now, I do think that we need pretty solid definitions of things so we can keep guidelines, but they are not to be warped to the extent that the radical gender activists would want. After all of that, here's my understanding of gender and sex, and I'll offer what I think should be a new definition for gender. Sex is just as we defined it in the beginning, which is the category of humans as it relates to your reproductive markers. This would be male, female, and intersex. Gender would then be the expression of biological sex to include physical, neuropsychological, and sometimes sociocultural characteristics, and exists on a spectrum between masculine and feminine, until such time that we might find some alien life form that's something completely unfathomable to us right now, but we're not there yet. I think this then allows for a more precise definition for people like myself who were born with anatomical features of one sex, but whose majority psychological processing and physical expressions are more of the opposite sex. So, I'm a female with a very masculine gender. Anyway, I'd love comments down below what you guys think about this video. If you have any other ideas on the topic, let it serve to help us make sense of ourselves and improve our relationships in the world. Until next time.